The fire department received the call at 1:30 in the afternoon on May the 14th, 2015. Flames were consuming one of the most prestigious homes in Washington, D.C.'s exclusive Woodley Park neighborhood. But here's what the firefighters didn't know. As they raced toward that burning mansion, what nobody could have possibly known in those first chaotic moments. Inside that inferno, 4 bodies were waiting to tell a story so horrifying, so meticulously cruel, that it would haunt this city for years to come. I'm about to take you inside those walls, before the flames, before the smoke, back to when the screaming started. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just a story about murder. This is a story about what happens when evil walks through your front door wearing a familiar face. And this is the story of how 18 hours of terror unfolded in one of America's most powerful zip codes, and how one man's calculated brutality destroyed an entire family, while the world outside remained completely oblivious. If this story moves you, if it makes you think twice about who you trust, I need you to do something right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, subscribe to this channel, because the details I'm about to reveal, the truth behind those flames, deserves to be known. Don't let this story die in the algorithm. Let's make sure the Savopoulos family is never forgotten. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent years piecing together every fragment of this case, every court document, every interview, every whispered confession. And now, I'm going to tell you everything. The Savopoulos mansion sat at 3201 Woodland Drive Northwest, a Georgian-style brick home that had watched over this wealthy neighborhood for decades. It was the kind of house that made people slow down as they drove past. The kind that whispered of old money and new success, of power wielded behind closed mahogany doors. The property sprawled across manicured lawns, protected by gates and hedges, a fortress of privilege in a city built on influence. Savvas Savopoulos had earned his place behind those walls. The 46-year-old businessman was the CEO of American Iron Works, a major construction materials company that had helped build some of the most iconic structures on the East Coast. He'd emigrated from Cyprus as a young man, carrying nothing but ambition and an unshakable work ethic. He'd married Amy, a woman whose grace and warmth balanced his intense drive for success. Together, they'd built not just a fortune, but a family. 3 daughters, a life that looked from the outside like the American dream rendered in brick and mortar. But dreams, I've learned, are fragile things. They shatter so easily when darkness decides to enter. Amy Savopoulos, at 47, was the heart of that household. She was the mother who remembered every school event, the wife who hosted dinner parties for her husband's business associates, the woman who made that massive house feel like a home. Their daughters, 2 of them away at boarding school that particular week, had grown up in rooms that echoed with laughter and privilege. The youngest, 10-year-old Phillip, still lived under that roof, still slept in his childhood bedroom, still ran through those halls with the boundless energy of a boy who had never known fear. And then there was Vera Figueroa, their housekeeper. Vera was 57 years old, a Salvadoran immigrant who had worked for the family for over 20 years. She knew every corner of that house, every family secret, every routine. She arrived each morning and left each evening, a constant presence in the Savopoulos orbit. To the children, she was practically family. To Savvas and Amy, she was indispensable. On the evening of May 13th, 2015, the sun set over Washington, D.C. like it had 1,000 times before. The city's monuments glowed amber in the fading light. Power brokers finished their dinners at exclusive restaurants. Lobbyists made their final calls. And in Woodley Park, the Savopoulos mansion stood silent and stately, its windows reflecting the dying day. Inside, the family moved through their evening routines. Savvas was likely thinking about work, about the deals that needed closing, the empire that needed tending. Amy was probably coordinating the household, checking in with her older daughters by phone, making sure young Phillip had finished his homework. Vera was preparing to leave for the night, gathering her things, saying her goodbyes. None of them knew that evil was already planning its approach. None of them could have sensed the darkness that would soon walk through their door. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A family in their home, safe, protected, surrounded by wealth and security and all the advantages that money can buy. Because what happened next proves that none of those things matter when fate has chosen you. None of those things can stop a predator who has already made his decision. The neighborhood of Woodley Park existed in a bubble of its own making. These were streets where ambassadors lived, where political power resided, where the assumption of safety was as much a given as the morning newspaper on the doorstep. Crimes like robbery, like home invasion, like murder, those were things that happened in other parts of the city, in neighborhoods that the residents of Woodland Drive preferred not to think about too closely. This bubble, this illusion of safety, would make the events of the next 18 hours even more incomprehensible. Because what was about to happen in the Savopoulos mansion wasn't just a crime. It was an invasion. It was a siege. It was a nightmare that unfolded in slow motion behind locked doors, while the world outside remained completely unaware. As night fell on May 13th, as the first domino was already tipping, somewhere in the city, a man was making his final preparations. He knew the house. He knew the routines. He knew exactly what he was looking for, and he had a plan to get it. What he lacked in conscience, he made up for in cunning. What he lacked in mercy, he compensated for with patience. The mansion's security systems, its gates and cameras and alarms, they were designed to keep out strangers. They were designed to protect against the unknown threat, the random criminal, the opportunistic burglar. But they were never designed to protect against someone who had already been inside. They were never designed to stop evil that had already been welcomed through the front door. I think about that often as I've researched this case, how we fortify ourselves against the threats we can imagine, the dangers we expect. We lock our doors against the stranger. We install cameras to catch the intruder. We build walls to separate ourselves from the chaos outside. But the most dangerous threats, the ones that truly destroy us, so often come from places we never thought to guard. They come wearing friendly faces. They come with references and recommendations. They come because we invited them in. As the clock is struck midnight crossing from May the 13th into May 14th, the Savopoulos household slept, or tried to sleep. We'll never know exactly when the terror began, never know the precise moment when their sense of safety was shattered forever. But we know it happened in the darkness. We know it started with a knock, or a forced entry, or perhaps just a shadow appearing where no shadow should be. What we know for certain is that by the time the sun rose on May the 14th, the Savopoulos family was already in hell. Their ordeal had begun, and there would be no rescue, no intervention, no cavalry riding over the hill. They were alone with their tormentor, isolated in their own home, held captive in the very rooms where they had once felt safest. The smoke that would eventually rise from that mansion, the flames that would consume the evidence of what happened inside, they were still hours away. But the fire, the real fire, the one that burns in the heart of a man capable of such cruelty, that fire was already blazing. I need to tell you about Daron Wint. I need you to understand who he was, where he came from, and how his path intersected so catastrophically with the Savopoulos family. Because nothing about this story makes sense until you understand the man who orchestrated it. Nothing about those 18 hours of terror becomes real until you see the face behind the mask. Daron Wint was born in Guyana in 1980. He grew up in a world far removed from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of Woodley Park, a world where poverty was a daily reality and opportunity was a scarce commodity. Like so many before him, he eventually made his way to the United States, carrying with him the same dream that had driven millions of immigrants to American shores: a better life, a fresh start, a chance to become something more than his circumstances had allowed. For a time, it seemed like that dream might actually come true. Wint found work, settled into life in the Maryland suburbs, and appeared to be just another face in the crowd of strivers and dreamers that made the Washington D.C. metropolitan area such a diverse tapestry of humanity. He was described by those who knew him as quiet, sometimes charming, a man who could blend in when he needed to. But beneath that unremarkable surface, something darker was brewing. Wint had a temper, a streak of violence that flashed without warning. He accumulated a criminal record, charges that hinted at the capacity for brutality that lay dormant within him. Assault, threats, behavior that should have been warning signs, but somehow never quite added up to a clear picture of the monster he would become. And then came the connection that would prove fatal. At some point in the early 2000s, Daron Wint went to work for American Iron Works. He became a welder for the very company that Savvas Savopoulos had built and led. For years, he worked in the industrial facilities, handling the heavy materials and hot metal that the company supplied to construction projects throughout the region. He was one of many workers, a face in the crowd, an employee who showed up, did his job, and went home. But Wint had been inside the mansion. Whether for a company event, a holiday party, or some other function, he had walked through those doors. He had seen the artwork on the walls. He had glimpsed the lifestyle that his employer enjoyed. He had measured the distance between his own circumstances and the wealth that surrounded Savvas Savopoulos like a golden aura. Eventually, Wint left American Iron Works. The circumstances of his departure varied depending on who told the story. Some said he was fired. Some said he quit. What mattered was that he was gone. But he hadn't forgotten. The memory of that house, of that wealth, of the life that Savvas Savopoulos lived, it stayed with him like a splinter working its way deeper into his consciousness. In the years that followed, Wint's life took a downward spiral. Legal troubles mounted. Money became scarce. The dreams that had once seemed possible receded further and further from his grasp. And somewhere in that descent, a plan began to form. A terrible, meticulous, patient plan. I've studied predators for a long time. I've tried to understand how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. And what I've learned is that there's rarely a single moment of transformation, a clear line where humanity ends and monstrousness begins. Instead, it's a gradual erosion, a slow wearing away of conscience and empathy, and the social bonds that keep most of us tethered to civilized behavior. It happens in darkness, in isolation, in the private theater of a troubled mind. For Daron Wint, that erosion had been happening for years. By the time he turned his attention back to the Savopoulos family, he was no longer the quiet worker who had once wielded steel and fire in their company's service. He was something else entirely, something cold, something calculating, something that looked at a 10-year-old boy and saw nothing but leverage. The plan, when it finally crystallized, was both simple and sophisticated. Wint knew that Savvas Savopoulos had access to substantial cash. He knew the layout of the mansion. He knew the family's routines, or could easily discover them with a little observation. What he needed was time. Time to extract the money, time to ensure his escape, time to eliminate any witnesses who might identify him. What he planned was not a robbery in any conventional sense. It was a siege. A hostage situation that would unfold behind closed doors, invisible to the outside world. While he methodically squeezed every dollar he could from his captives before silencing them forever. I want to pause here and ask you something. As you're listening to this, as you're picturing Daron Wint making his preparations, choosing his moment, rehearsing his violence, I want you to think about a question. Do you believe that evil like this is born or made? Are there people who come into this world already marked for darkness, or does life twist them into shapes they were never meant to take? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you believe about the nature of monsters, because understanding that question is central to understanding everything that happened in that mansion. The evening of May the 13th arrived like any other. The city hummed with its usual energy. Traffic clogged the arteries of the capital. Politicians made speeches. Ordinary people lived ordinary lives. And in Woodley Park, the Savopoulos family went about their evening without any sense that danger was approaching. We know now that Wint had been watching. We know that he understood the rhythms of the household, knew when the older daughters would be away, knew when the house would be most vulnerable. He had chosen this moment with care, balancing his need for access against his need for control. Fewer people meant fewer variables. Fewer variables meant a greater chance of success. What we don't know, what we can never truly know, is what was in his mind as he made his approach. Was there any hesitation? Any flicker of doubt? Any last-moment consideration of the lives he was about to destroy? The evidence suggests not. The evidence suggests that by the time Wint crossed the threshold of that mansion, he had already crossed every moral threshold that might have stopped him. The invasion happened sometime after dark. The exact sequence of events remains partly obscured, partly reconstructed from evidence and testimony, partly lost forever in the silence of the dead. But we know that Wint gained entry to the home. We know that he quickly established control over its occupants. We know that within a short time, Savvas, Amy, young Phillip, and eventually Vera Figueroa were all under his power. Picture it. The fear in Amy's eyes as she realized what was happening. the protective instinct that must have surged through Savvas as he saw his family threatened. The confusion and terror of 10-year-old Phillip, suddenly confronted with a nightmare that no child should ever have to comprehend. And all of them, all four of them, at the mercy of a man who had no mercy to give. Wint bound them. He controlled them. He separated them into different parts of the house, isolating them from each other, preventing them from coordinating any resistance or escape. He was organized. He was methodical. He had thought about this moment for a long time, and now that it had arrived, he executed his plan with chilling efficiency. The house that had been a sanctuary became a prison. The home that had witnessed birthday parties and holiday celebrations and countless ordinary moments of family life became a torture chamber. And outside those walls, the neighborhood slept on, oblivious to the horror unfolding just beyond their sight. I think about the neighbors often, the people who lived on Woodland Drive, who walked their dogs and collected their mail and went about their lives just yards away from unimaginable suffering. Could they have noticed something? Should they have heard something? The questions haunt me, even though I know the answers don't really matter. Evil had chosen that house, that family, that moment. And nothing short of divine intervention could have stopped what was already in motion. The night stretched on like a held breath, each hour bringing new torments for the captive family. I'm going to walk you through what we know of those dark hours, understanding that some details come from evidence left behind, some from confessions, and some from the terrible logic of reconstruction. This is the part of the story where I need you to prepare yourself. This is where the nightmare reaches its full suffocating weight. Daron Wint had a singular obsession during those captive hours: money. Specifically $40,000 in cash that he believed Savvas Savopoulos could access. Why that amount? Why cash? The answer likely lies in Wint's circumstances and his understanding of how wealthy people like Savopoulos operated. He knew that a man of Savvas's means could produce that sum without involving police or banks or any of the institutional safeguards that might have brought help. Through the long night, Wint forced Savvas to make arrangements. Calls were made. Texts were sent. Savvas, with a knife at his family's throat, with his wife and son held hostage in other rooms, did everything in his power to comply with his captor's demands. He reached out to his assistant. He requested the money. He played along with the fiction that everything was normal, that this was just an unusual but legitimate business need. Can you imagine that phone call? Can you imagine speaking to someone in the outside world, knowing that your family's lives depended on sounding calm, sounding normal, sounding like nothing was wrong? Savvas Savopoulos was a powerful man, a successful man, a man accustomed to controlling situations and bending circumstances to his will. But in those hours he was helpless. All his success, all his wealth, all his influence, none of it could protect the people he loved. The assistant, Jordan Wallace, was confused by the request but ultimately complied. $40,000 in cash was packaged and delivered to the Savopoulos mansion on the morning of May the 14th. The money was left with a driver who handed it over without any suspicion that something was terribly wrong. The transaction was quick, professional, unremarkable, and inside the house, the family's fate was sealed. What happened during the night itself remains partially hidden. Evidence suggests that the family members were held in different parts of the house, that they were bound, that they were subjected to both physical and psychological torture. Savvas, in particular, showed signs of having been beaten. The violence was not random, it was purposeful. It was designed to ensure compliance, to break resistance, to establish absolute control. I want you to think about time for a moment. How slowly it must have moved for that family. Every minute an eternity, every hour a lifetime. They had no way of knowing if help was coming. They had no way of knowing what the dawn would bring. They could only wait and hope and pray that somehow they would survive this endless night. Hope is a strange thing in situations like this. It can sustain you through horrors that would otherwise be unbearable. But it can also be a form of torture in itself, extending your suffering, making you believe in a rescue that will never come. The Savopoulos family hoped. They had to hope. It was all they had left. And Vera Figueroa? She arrived for work on the morning of May the 14th, completely unaware of what she was walking into. She had been with this family for over 2 decades. She had watched the children grow. She had witnessed birthdays and graduations and all the milestones that mark the passage of a family's life. She walked through that door expecting an ordinary day, and instead she walked into the heart of the nightmare. Wint captured her immediately. She became another hostage, another loose end that would need to be tied. Her presence complicated things, added another variable, another witness, another person who could identify him if she survived. But by that point, Wint had already committed to his course. There would be no witnesses. There would be no survivors. Everyone who had seen his face would die. The money arrived around 10:30 in the morning. $40,000 delivered in a package, accepted at the door. From Wint's perspective, the hardest part was over. He had the cash. He had maintained control for nearly 12 hours without detection. Now all that remained was the cleanup. But here's what I need you to understand about what happened next. The money was never really the point. Or rather, the money alone was never going to satisfy whatever dark hunger drove Daron Wint. Because even after he had what he came for, even after the package was in his hands and the door was closed and the house was secure, he didn't leave, he stayed. And the killing began. There's a particular horror in that sequence, the ransom paid, the demands met, and still, no mercy. It tells us something about the nature of the man we're dealing with. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. This was about control. This was about the terrible pleasure that some people take in having absolute dominion over other human beings. I've read the court documents. I've seen the evidence photos. I know what was done in that house. And I'm going to share some of it with you because I believe the truth deserves to be told. But I also want to warn you that what comes next is deeply disturbing. If you need to pause, to take a breath, to prepare yourself, I understand completely. The family was killed one by one. The method was blunt force, trauma, savage beatings that ended lives that had been filled with promise and potential. Savvas, the immigrant entrepreneur who had built an empire through hard work and determination, murdered in his own home. Amy, the devoted mother who had given her life to her family, bludgeoned to death while her child was still in the house. Young Phillip, just 10 years old, a boy who had his whole life ahead of him, killed by a man who had no concept of innocence or mercy. And Vera Figueroa, the loyal housekeeper who had simply shown up for work on what she thought was an ordinary day. Killed because she had seen too much. Killed because she was a witness. Killed because Daron Wint could not leave anyone alive who might send him to prison. 4 lives. 4 people who had woken up on May the 13th with no idea that they had less than 36 hours left to live. 4 people whose futures were stolen by a man who had once worked in their company, who had once been welcomed into their home, who had taken their hospitality and their paychecks and repaid them with unimaginable cruelty. After the killing was done, Wint set about covering his tracks. He loaded the bodies into different areas of the house. He gathered accelerants. He poured gasoline over the scene of his crimes, over the bodies of his victims, over the evidence of his 18-hour occupation, and then he struck a match. The fire department received the call at 1:30 in the afternoon. By the time they arrived, the mansion was fully engulfed. Flames leaped from windows. Smoke billowed into the spring sky. The neighbors, finally drawn from their homes by the commotion, stood on the street and watched as the Savopoulos family's dream burned. Firefighters battled the blaze, containing it, extinguishing it, finally entering the smoking ruins to search for survivors. What they found instead were 4 bodies, charred but not destroyed, bearing the unmistakable signs of violence that no fire could conceal. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic mishap. This was murder, and the flames had been set to hide it. The crime scene investigators who arrived in the aftermath faced a daunting task. Fire destroys so much evidence, consumes so many clues, turns ordered scenes into chaos. But the fire had not destroyed everything. DNA remained. Physical evidence remained. The skeleton of the truth remained, waiting to be assembled by patient hands. And crucially, one piece of evidence survived that would eventually point directly to Daron Wint: a pizza crust, left behind in the house, bearing the DNA of the man who had held this family hostage, who had demanded their money, who had taken their lives and tried to burn away his sins. In the ashes of the Savopoulos mansion, investigators began the painstaking work of reconstruction. Every murder tells a story, leaves behind a narrative written in blood and fiber and trace evidence. The fire had complicated that story, had burned away pages and obscured chapters, but it had not destroyed it entirely. And slowly, methodically, the truth began to emerge. I've always been fascinated by forensic science, by the way that the smallest details can unlock the largest mysteries. A hair, a fingerprint, a strand of DNA, invisible to the naked eye. These fragments become the building blocks of justice, the foundation upon which cases are built and murderers are brought to account. In the Savopoulos case, that foundation would prove remarkably solid, despite the fire's best efforts. The bodies told the first part of the story. Despite the flames, the medical examiner could determine manner of death, could identify the blunt force trauma that had ended each life, could establish that the fire had been set after death to conceal the evidence of murder. This wasn't a house fire that had tragically claimed lives. This was a crime scene that someone had tried to destroy. The timeline began to take shape. Investigators spoke with everyone who had contact with the family in the days leading up to the fire. They learned about the unusual text messages that Savvas had sent. They learned about the cash that had been requested and delivered. They learned about the strange sequence of events that, in retrospect, screamed that something was terribly wrong. Jordan Wallace, the assistant who had arranged for the $40,000, became a crucial witness. His testimony established that Savvas had made unusual requests on the morning of May 14th, requests that now made sense only in the context of a hostage situation. The money had been a ransom, paid in a desperate attempt to save his family. It hadn't worked. Vera Figueroa's husband reported that she hadn't come home from work. Her presence at the scene, killed alongside the family she had served for so long, added another dimension to the tragedy. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another innocent caught up in Wint's murderous scheme. But the breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the pizza. At some point during his occupation of the house, Wint had ordered delivery. A Domino's pizza, paid for on the Savopoulos family's account, delivered right to the door of the house where 4 people were being held hostage. The audacity of it still stuns me. The casualness with which Wint ate his dinner while planning the execution of an entire family speaks to a level of sociopathy that defies comprehension. The crust of that pizza was found in the wreckage of the house, discarded, forgotten, overlooked by a killer who was focused on larger concerns. And on that crust, DNA. Saliva from the mouth of the person who had eaten that slice. Genetic material that would be run through databases and matched against known offenders. The match came back to Daron Wint. Suddenly, the investigation had a face, a name, a history. Detectives pulled Wint's records and discovered his connection to American Iron Works. They learned that he had worked for Savvas Savopoulos' company, that he had been inside the mansion before, that he had the knowledge and the motive, and now the forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The hunt was on. I think about that pizza often. The sheer arrogance of ordering delivery while holding a family hostage. The comfort that Wint must have felt, sitting in that mansion eating his meal, knowing that his victims were bound and helpless in other rooms. It speaks to a mind that had completely disconnected from normal human emotion, that could compartmentalize murder and appetite, that could sit among the terrified and the doomed and think about what toppings he wanted. But arrogance is often the undoing of criminals. The same confidence that allowed Wint to order that pizza also led him to leave the crust behind. He was so certain that the fire would destroy all evidence, so sure of his own cleverness, that he got sloppy. And that sloppiness would cost him his freedom. On May 21st, 1 week after the fire, the U.S. Marshals caught up with Daron Wint. He was attempting to flee, traveling in a moving truck with a car in tow, accompanied by several other individuals who may or may not have been aware of his crimes. The arrest was dramatic, but controlled. Wint was taken into custody without incident. His flight ended before it really began. In the truck, investigators found more evidence: $30,000 in cash, presumably the remainder of the ransom after Wint had spent some on his escape preparations. Money orders totaling more than $10,000. Materials that suggested Wint had been planning to disappear, to start fresh somewhere far from Washington, D.C., to escape the consequences of what he had done. But there would be no escape. The evidence was too strong, the DNA too damning, the case too airtight. Daron Wint would face justice for the murder of Savvas, Amy, and Phillip Savopoulos, and for the murder of Vera Figueroa. The investigation also raised questions that have never been fully answered. Did Wint act alone? The logistics of controlling 4 people for 18 hours seemed challenging for a single person. Some investigators believed he had accomplices, partners who helped him manage the hostages and execute his plan. But despite extensive investigation, no one else was ever charged. Wint either acted alone or was protected by those who helped him. The truth remains hidden. I want to tell you something about justice. It's imperfect. It's slow. It often fails to provide the closure that victims' families desperately need, but sometimes, just sometimes, it works. Sometimes the evidence survives the fire. Sometimes the DNA matches the database. Sometimes the arrogant criminal makes a mistake that leads directly to his arrest. The Savopoulos case is one of those times. Despite Wint's careful planning, despite the fire he set to cover his crimes, despite his attempt to flee, justice found him. The system that so often fails, that lets murderers walk free on technicalities, that re-traumatizes survivors with endless delays and appeals. That system worked. It took time, it took patience, it took the dedication of investigators who refused to let a burned crime scene stop them from finding the truth. But it worked. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a courtroom. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the American flag standing sentinel in the corner. Now fill that courtroom with the weight of 4 murders, with the grief of families destroyed, with the cold presence of a man who showed no remorse for the lives he had taken. This was the stage on which Daron Wint would face his final judgment. This was where the truth would finally be laid bare. The trial began in October 2018, more than 3 years after the fire that consumed the Savopoulos mansion. Justice, as I said, moves slowly. The wheels of the legal system grind at their own pace, indifferent to the suffering of those waiting for resolution. For the families of the victims, those 3 years were an eternity. For Daron Wint, they were borrowed time. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, constructing a narrative of greed, captivity, and cold-blooded murder. The DNA on the pizza crust. The financial records showing the ransom payment. The testimony of Jordan Wallace and others who had interacted with the family in those final hours. The forensic evidence from the burned mansion. Each piece added to the picture, until the portrait of guilt was unmistakable. But it was the testimony of the survivors, the family members left behind, that gave the trial its emotional weight. Savvas and Amy's daughters had lost their parents and their brother in a single devastating stroke. They had been away at school when evil entered their home, returning to find that everything they loved had been taken from them. Their grief filled that courtroom like smoke, permeating every moment of the proceedings. Vera Figueroa's family testified as well. They spoke of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others, who had treated the Savopoulos children as if they were her own, who had walked into work that morning expecting nothing more unusual than laundry and meals and the quiet routines of domestic life. She had died simply because she showed up, simply because she was there, simply because Daron Wint couldn't leave a witness alive. The defense, as defenses in such cases must, tried to create doubt. And they questioned the DNA evidence. They suggested that others might have been involved. They attempted to paint Wint as a troubled man rather than a cold-blooded killer. But their arguments felt hollow against the weight of the prosecution's case. There was too much evidence, too many connections, too clear a line between Daron Wint and the deaths of 4 innocent people. Wint himself was a cipher throughout the trial. He sat at the defense table watching the proceedings with an expression that betrayed nothing. No remorse, no guilt, no human emotion whatsoever. It was as if the man who had tortured and murdered a family had simply checked out, had retreated to some inner fortress where the reality of his crimes could not reach him. I've seen criminals show remorse, seen them break down under the weight of what they've done, seen them reach for some kind of redemption, even as they face the consequences of their actions. Wint showed none of that. Whatever soul he might once have possessed seemed to have burned away long before he set fire to that mansion. He was empty. He was cold. He was exactly the kind of monster that parents warn their children about. The jury deliberated for 12 hours over 2 days. 12 hours to weigh the evidence, 12 hours to consider the arguments, 12 hours to decide whether the state had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Daron Wint was responsible for the deaths of Savvas, Amy, and Phillip Savopoulos, and Vera Figueroa. When they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty on all counts, guilty of crimes that would ensure Daron Wint spent the rest of his natural life behind bars. The families wept. The attorneys embraced. The judge thanked the jury for their service, and Daron Wint was led away in chains, his freedom finally and forever at an end. I want to talk about what justice means in a case like this. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal the wounds of those left behind. It doesn't undo the 18 hours of terror that Savvas, Amy, Phillip, and Vera endured before their deaths. Justice in the truest sense is impossible. No punishment can balance the scales when 4 lives have been taken. But there is value in accountability. There is meaning in saying clearly and publicly that what Daron Wint did was wrong, that society does not accept such crimes, that those who commit them will be pursued, caught, tried, and punished. The verdict in Wint's case sent a message, not just to him, but to anyone who might consider similar acts. You will not get away with it. You will be found. You will pay. In December 2018, Daron Wint was sentenced. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. 1 sentence for each life he took. He would die in prison, his freedom gone, his future erased, his only legacy the suffering he had caused. The judge's words at sentencing were measured but powerful. This was a crime of extraordinary cruelty, committed against innocent people who had done nothing to deserve their fate. The family had welcomed Wint's employer into their home, had treated his workers with respect, had lived their lives without any awareness that danger was being plotted against them. And they had paid for that innocence with their lives. As Wint was led away, the Savopoulos daughters watched. Their faces carried the weight of everything they had lost, everything they would never have again. Parents who would never see them graduate, marry, have children of their own. A brother whose laughter would never again echo through their lives. A future that had been stolen by a man who saw their family's wealth and decided he was entitled to take it. But in their eyes, I also saw something else. Determination, resolve, the quiet strength of people who refused to be defined by their trauma. They had lost everything, but they hadn't been destroyed. They would carry their grief forward, transform it into purpose, honor the memory of their loved ones by living fully and loving deeply. That is the victory that evil can never claim. The victory of continuing. The victory of refusing to let tragedy have the final word. the victory of love surviving even when those we love do not. Let me tell you about the Savopoulos sisters, about the two young women who were away at boarding school when their family was murdered, about the burden they carry and the strength they've shown, about how grief transforms those it touches, sometimes breaking them, sometimes forging them into something stronger than they ever knew they could be. Anastasia and Katerina Savopoulos lost their parents and their brother. On May the 14th, 2015, they were teenagers, old enough to understand the magnitude of what had happened, young enough that the rest of their lives would be shaped by this loss. In an instant, they went from privileged daughters of a successful family to orphans, left to navigate a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous and uncertain than they had ever imagined. I can't tell you exactly how they spent those first days and weeks after the fire. The grief belongs to them, private and sacred. But I can tell you what we've learned from their public appearances, from the statements they've made, from the way they've chosen to honor their family's memory. They chose to focus on the love. In a situation that could have produced only bitterness and rage, they found a way to remember not how their family died, but how they lived. Savvas's determination and generosity, Amy's warmth and devotion, Phillip's energy and joy. These were the memories they clung to, the stories they told, the legacy they preserved. And the charitable work began almost immediately. The Savopoulos family had always been philanthropic, supporting causes in their community and beyond. The daughters continued that tradition, establishing memorial funds, supporting organizations that reflected their parents' values, ensuring that the family name would be associated with good works rather than tragedy. I've seen grief counselors talk about the stages of mourning: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But what those clinical terms don't capture is the way the grief weaves itself into the fabric of daily life. The empty chair at the table, the birthday that no one celebrates anymore, the phone call you start to make before remembering that no one will answer. Grief is not a journey with a clear destination. It's a lifelong companion, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming, always present. For the Savopoulos sisters, that companion will never fully leave. They will grow older. They will build their own families. They will achieve successes and weather failures. And through it all, they will carry the weight of May 14th, 2015, the day that divided their lives, into before and after. But here's what I've learned from studying their story, from watching how they've navigated the aftermath of tragedy. They refuse to let Daron Wint define them. They refuse to become victims, perpetually broken, forever trapped in the moment of their worst loss. They chose, instead, to become survivors, to take the shattered pieces of their family and build something new, to honor their parents and brother not through endless mourning, but through purposeful living. That choice is not made once. It's made every day, every hour, every moment when the grief threatens to overwhelm. It's a choice that requires enormous strength, the kind of strength that most of us will never be tested enough to discover we possess. The Savopoulos sisters made that choice, and they continue to make it. I also want to speak about Vera Figueroa's family, about her husband, who waited for her to come home from work and received instead news of her death, about her children and grandchildren who lost a mother and grandmother to someone else's crime, about the community of immigrants who knew her, who mourned her, who understood that she had come to America seeking a better life, and found instead a cruel and senseless end. Vera's story often gets lost in the larger narrative of the Savopoulos murders. The wealthy family naturally draws more attention, more coverage, more analysis. But Vera was no less innocent, no less valuable, no less deserving of justice. She was a working woman who had spent decades in faithful service, who had earned the trust and affection of the family she worked for, who had walked into that mansion on May 14th expecting nothing more than another ordinary day. Her family has been less visible than the Savopoulos daughters, more private in their grief, but they too have had to find ways to continue, to honor her memory, to make sense of a loss that will never make sense. They too are survivors of Daron Wint's cruelty. I think about the ripples that violence sends through a community. The murder of 4 people doesn't just affect their immediate families. It touches everyone who knew them, everyone who worked with them, everyone who lived in their neighborhood or attended their church or shared their lives in any way. Those ripples spread outward, circles of grief and fear that eventually reach strangers like you and me, people who never met the Savopoulos family but who feel the weight of their story nonetheless. That's why I'm telling you this story. That's why I've spent these chapters walking you through every detail of this terrible crime. Because the Savopoulos family deserves to be more than a headline, more than a true crime curiosity, more than entertainment for people scrolling through their feeds. They deserve to be remembered as they were. A father who built an empire through hard work, a mother who devoted herself to her family, a son whose life was cut short before it really began, and a housekeeper whose loyalty was repaid with death. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with me through the darkness of the story, then you understand why it matters. You understand that these weren't just victims. They were people. They had dreams and fears and hopes and loves. They had breakfast together and laughed at jokes and worried about the future. They were alive, fully and completely alive, until Daron Wint took that from them. I want to step back now and look at the larger picture, to examine the systems that failed the Savopoulos family and the systems that ultimately delivered justice. Because their story is not just about one murderer and his victims. It's about the world we live in, the assumptions we make about safety and security, the institutions we trust to protect us. Start with the security that surrounded that mansion, the gates, the cameras, the alarm systems, all the expensive technology that money can buy to keep danger at bay. It failed. Not because it was defective, but because it was designed to stop strangers, not former employees. Because no amount of security can protect you from someone who has already been inside, who knows your routines, who has been welcomed through your door. This is the lesson that wealthy people, people who can afford to wall themselves off from the world, need to understand. Security is an illusion. It can be pierced. The stronger your walls, the more you believe in your own safety, the more devastating the intrusion when it finally comes. The Savopoulos family trusted their fortress. That fortress became their prison. Then there's the question of employment and background checks. Daron Wint had a criminal record before he ever worked for American Iron Works. Should he have been hired in the first place? Should companies be more careful about who they bring into their orbit, who they give access to their executives and their families? These are uncomfortable questions because they bump up against our beliefs, in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that people can change. I don't have easy answers. I know that many people with criminal records go on to live honest, productive lives. I know that employment is one of the best predictors of reduced recidivism. I know that barring everyone with a past from opportunity creates its own kind of injustice. But I also know that Daron Wint murdered 4 people, and that his previous behavior should have been a warning sign. The legal system, too, deserves examination. The trial took more than 3 years to begin. 3 years during which the families waited, the evidence was analyzed. The attorneys prepared their arguments. Why does justice take so long? Why must those who have already suffered so much be forced to endure years of uncertainty before they can begin to find closure? Part of the answer is procedural. The right to a fair trial means that defendants have time to prepare their defense, to challenge evidence, to ensure that their conviction is based on proof beyond reasonable doubt. These protections exist for good reasons: to prevent the railroading of innocent people, to ensure that the state's awesome power is checked by process and procedure. But procedure can become its own form of cruelty when it stretches the suffering of victims' families indefinitely. There must be a balance, a way to ensure fairness, while also honoring the need for timely resolution. The Savopoulos case took too long. The families deserved better. And then there's the question I keep coming back to, the question that haunts every case like this. Could it have been prevented? Were there moments when the trajectory toward violence could have been altered, when someone might have intervened, when a different choice might have saved 4 lives? I don't know. The honest answer is that I don't know. We can point to warning signs in Wint's past. We can wonder whether earlier intervention might have changed his path. We can question the systems that allowed him to slip through, to nurse his grievances, to plan his crime undetected. But in the end, responsibility rests with the man who chose violence. The man who looked at a family and saw only obstacles between himself and money. The man who murdered without hesitation and set fire to the evidence without remorse. Evil exists. That's the uncomfortable truth that cases like this force us to confront. Despite all our systems and safeguards, despite all our efforts at prevention and protection, evil exists. It walks among us. It wears familiar faces. And sometimes, despite everything we do, it wins. But not forever. That's the counter-truth that gives me hope. Evil might win battles, but it doesn't have to win the war. Daron Wint murdered 4 people, but he didn't escape. He was caught, tried, convicted, sentenced. He will die in prison, his freedom taken, his future erased. The system that failed to prevent his crime succeeded in punishing it. And the families he destroyed found the strength to continue, to honor their loved ones, to refuse the role of victims, to transform their grief into purpose. Evil did not have the final word. Love did. Resilience did. The human capacity to endure and overcome did. And that's the story I want to leave you with as we move toward the end of this narrative. Not just the horror of what happened in that mansion, but the response to that horror. The ways that good people picked up the pieces, held each other close, and kept moving forward. 5 years after the fire. 10 years. Time moves forward, indifferent to our grief, carrying us further and further from the events that shaped us. The Savopoulos mansion is gone now, demolished, replaced by new construction that holds no memory of what happened there. The neighborhood has changed. The city has changed. The world has spun through its seasons, and life has continued for those who survived. I want to tell you about those continuing lives, about the ripples that spread outward from May the 14th, 2015, touching people and places that might seem far removed from that burning house in Woodley Park. The American Iron Works continued to operate after Savvas's death. The company he had built, the legacy of his immigrant ambition, survived its founder. Other hands took the wheel, guiding the enterprise through the aftermath of tragedy, ensuring that what Savvas had created would not die with him. There is something powerful in that continuity, something that speaks to the difference between a person and their life's work. Savvas is gone, but the iron still flows, the buildings still rise, the business he built that still employs workers and serves customers. The philanthropic initiatives that the Savopoulos family supported continued as well. The daughters made sure of that. They established scholarships in their parents' names, ensuring that young people would have opportunities because Savvas and Amy had lived. They supported causes that reflected their family's values, extending the reach of their generosity beyond the grave. This too is legacy. This too is a way of ensuring that evil does not have the final word. In the broader true crime community, the Savopoulos case became a subject of intense study and discussion. Podcasts dissected the investigation. Television specials recounted the horror. Books examined the psychology of Daron Wint and the failures of systems that might have stopped him. This attention is a double-edged sword, bringing awareness to the case while also risking the reduction of real tragedy to entertainment. I've struggled with that tension in creating this narrative. I want to honor the victims, to tell their story with the gravity it deserves, while also knowing that I'm part of an industry that monetizes suffering. The best I can do is try to be thoughtful, to remember that these were real people, to never lose sight of the humanity at the center of the horror. The legal precedents set by the case rippled through the justice system as well. The investigation techniques, the handling of the DNA evidence, the prosecution strategies, all of these became part of the institutional memory that guides future cases. Each trial teaches lessons. Each investigation develops methods. Each prosecution refines approaches. In this way, even tragedy contributes to the slow improvement of our systems of justice. And what of Daron Wint? He sits in a cell, his days reduced to the monotonous rhythms of incarceration. He will never again walk freely, never again order pizza to a house where his victims cower, never again set fires to hide his crimes. The walls that surround him now are not the elegant walls of a Woodley Park mansion, but the stark walls of a federal prison, designed not to protect, but to contain. Does he feel remorse? Does he understand, in any meaningful way, the suffering he caused? The trial suggested not. His demeanor throughout remained flat, affectless, the emotional landscape of a person fundamentally disconnected from normal human feeling. But only he knows what goes on behind that mask. What thoughts fill the long hours of confinement, what the future holds for a soul that chose such darkness. I find that I don't care much about Wint's inner life. My attention is drawn instead to those who survived him, those who have had to build new lives in the shadow of what he did. The daughters finding their way forward, the extended family holding each other close, the community that absorbed the shock and slowly, painfully healed. Because that's where the real story lies. Not in the psychology of a murderer, but in the resilience of those he couldn't destroy. Not in the mechanics of his crime, but in the mechanics of recovery. Not in his fall, but in their rise. I promised you a story that would stay with you. A story that would make you think, make you feel, make you reconsider the assumptions you carry about safety and danger, trust and betrayal, evil and goodness. As we near the end of this journey together, I want to distill what we've learned into lessons that might, just might, protect you or someone you love from a similar fate. The first lesson is the hardest. Trust, but verify. The Savopoulos family trusted their security. They trusted the systems they had put in place. They trusted that their status and their wealth would protect them from the chaos of the world outside. That trust was not entirely misplaced, but it was incomplete. Real security requires constant attention, regular reassessment, the humility to acknowledge that no system is perfect. If you employ people in your home or business, know them. Really know them. Background checks are a start, but they're not enough. Pay attention to behavior, to changes, to warning signs. Not with paranoia, but with awareness. The person who might harm you most is not the stranger at the gate, but the familiar face who has already been inside. The second lesson is about the value of contingency plans. We don't like to think about worst-case scenarios. They're uncomfortable. They force us to confront our own vulnerability. But the Savopoulos family might have survived if there had been a system in place, a code word, a check-in protocol that would have alerted the outside world that something was wrong. Businesses do this all the time. Families should too. Establish a signal with your loved ones. Something that seems innocuous but indicates danger. A word you can slip into a phone conversation. A text that looks normal but means send help. It might never be needed. But if it ever is, it could save lives. The third lesson is about the importance of community. Woodley Park was a neighborhood of high walls and private lives. The residents didn't know each other well, didn't pay close attention to what happened behind closed doors. This isolation allowed the crime to unfold undetected for 18 hours. A more connected community might have noticed something wrong, might have intervened, might have saved lives. We've built a world that celebrates privacy and independence. These are valuable things, but they come at a cost. When we don't know our neighbors, when we don't watch out for each other, we create the conditions in which evil can operate unobserved. Building community takes effort. It takes time. It takes the willingness to be involved in each other's lives. But that involvement is its own form of protection. The fourth lesson is about the aftermath of tragedy. If the worst happens, if you or someone you love is touched by violence, know that you can survive it. The Savopoulos daughters lost everything and they kept going. The human capacity for resilience is greater than we imagine until we're tested. Grief will not destroy you unless you let it. Help is available. Community exists. You are not alone. And the fifth lesson, the most important of all, is about how we live in the shadow of uncertainty. We cannot predict when evil will touch our lives. We cannot guarantee our own safety or the safety of those we love. The world is unpredictable, sometimes cruel, often unfair. This is the truth that cases like the Savopoulos murders force us to confront. But this truth should not lead to despair It should lead instead to appreciation, to gratitude for each day that passes without catastrophe, to love expressed openly and often, to the understanding that our time is limited and precious, and not to be wasted on petty concerns. The Savopoulos family had breakfast together on the morning of May 13th, 2015. They had no idea it would be their last breakfast. They had no warning that evil was approaching. And yet, that breakfast was still valuable. That ordinary moment was still precious. The love they shared, even if they didn't know to treasure it specifically, was still real. Live your life that way, not in fear of what might come, but in appreciation for what you have. Tell the people you love that you love them. Don't wait for a special occasion. Don't assume there will always be time later. Say it now, mean it now, because you never know when now is all you have. I began this story with fire. Let me end it with what rises from the ashes. The Savopoulos mansion is gone. The physical structure that witnessed such horror has been erased, replaced by new construction that carries no memory of May 14th, 2015. This is appropriate in a way. Buildings should not become shrines to violence. The ground should not be permanently marked by the crimes that occurred upon it. Life moves on. The world makes space for new stories. But while the house is gone, the legacy of those who lived there persists. Savvas Savopoulos is remembered not as a victim but as a builder, a man who came to America with nothing and created an empire through hard work and vision. His story is the story of immigrants throughout our history, people who saw opportunity in this country and seized it with both hands. That story does not end with his murder. It continues in the company he built, in the wealth he created, in the example he set for others who would follow the same path. Amy Savopoulos is remembered as a mother, devoted, loving, present in ways that busy parents so often fail to be. She made that mansion a home, filled it with warmth, ensured that her children knew they were valued and loved, that love survives her. It lives in her daughters, shapes them, guides them forward through their grief. A mother's love is immortal. It transcends death. It becomes part of the very fabric of those who received it. Phillip Savopoulos is remembered as potential, a 10-year-old boy who never got to become the man he might have been. We can only imagine what he might have accomplished, what joys and sorrows he might have experienced, what contributions he might have made to the world. His death is perhaps the hardest to bear because it represents so much lost future. But even in loss, he is remembered. His sisters carry his memory. Those who knew him speak of his energy, his curiosity, his joy. He existed, he mattered, and that existence continues to reverberate through those who loved him. Vera Figueroa is remembered as faithful. For more than 2 decades, she cared for a family that was not her own, gave her best years to service, treated other people's children with the love she held for her own. She represents countless domestic workers whose labor is often invisible, whose contributions go unacknowledged, whose humanity is overlooked. In death, she has become visible. Her story is told alongside the wealthy family she served. Her loss is mourned equally. This, too, is a kind of justice, a recognition that every life has equal value regardless of economic status. And Daron Wint? He is remembered as evil, as a cautionary tale, as proof that the monster in the story sometimes wears a familiar face. He will die in prison unmourned by any but perhaps the most troubled members of his family. His legacy is a lesson. This is what happens when you choose violence. This is the end that awaits those who prey upon the innocent. Bars and concrete, and the slow erosion of years in confinement. The story of the Savopoulos mansion murders does not end with victory for the victims. I can't give you that. Death is final, and no amount of justice can undo what was done. But it ends with something else, something that matters perhaps even more. It ends with resilience, with the continuation of love despite loss, with the demonstration that evil, even when it succeeds in the short term, cannot triumph over the human spirit. The daughters of Savvas and Amy Savopoulos are living proof of this truth. They have taken their grief and transformed it into purpose. They carry their family's legacy forward. They honor the dead by living fully. They refuse to let Daron Wint have the final word. This is the victory that matters, not the verdict, though that mattered, not the sentence, though that was just. The real victory is in the continuing, in the refusal to be destroyed, in the choice, made again and again, to build something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. I've walked with you through 10 chapters of horror and hope. I've told you about fire and blood and the darkest depths of human cruelty. But I hope what stays with you is something else. The love that the Savopoulos family shared, the resilience that their survivors have shown, the truth that even in the worst circumstances, even when evil seems to win, the human capacity for goodness and endurance persists. Remember them? Savvas, the builder. Amy, the mother. Phillip, the boy who should have grown old. Vera, the faithful servant. Remember that they were real, that they mattered, that their lives had meaning beyond the manner of their deaths. And remember this, you have people in your life who love you. Tell them. You have moments of ordinary joy that deserve to be treasured. Treasure them. You have a future that is uncertain but full of possibility. Live it well. The fire at the Savopoulos mansion has long since burned out, but the light of the lives that were lost there continues to shine. In the memories of those who knew them, in the stories we tell, in the lessons we learn, in the love that survives. That light will never be extinguished. That is the final victory. That is how love defeats death. That is how we ensure that evil, no matter how terrible, never truly wins. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about your own life, your own loves, your own mortality, then the Savopoulos family's legacy has grown by one more person. Share this story. Not for me, but for them. Let their memory spread. Let their lessons be learned. Let their light continue to shine. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that matter. Not just entertainment, but truth. Not just horror, but hope. Together, we can ensure that the victims of violence are never forgotten, that their stories are told with the gravity they deserve, that their deaths become something more than statistics. The Savopoulos mansion is gone, but what happened there will never be forgotten. And from those ashes, something beautiful has risen. The determination of those who survived, the commitment to justice that put their killer behind bars, the love that persists, undiminished, undimmed, undefeated. This is the end of the story, but it's not really an end at all. It's a beginning. The beginning of your awareness, your gratitude, your commitment to living fully while you have the chance. Don't waste it. Life is shorter than we think. Love is more precious than we know. And every ordinary moment is a gift that might be taken from us without warning. The Savopoulos family had their last morning together on May the 13th, 2015. Make sure you treasure yours